Now, hours ago, the Court of Appeal in Kenya lifted the suspension of a hotly disputed finance law, which will raise a range of taxes and also impose some new ones. Now, among other things, the 2023 Finance Act is doubling value-added tax on fuel, specifically petrol, kerosene and diesel. And it's also introducing a range of new taxes, including a new housing levy. That law was partly responsible for triggering deadly opposition protests earlier this month, which left dozens dead. The case challenging the finance law was first brought to court by an opposition senator, Okeya Omtata. He's seeking a declaration that certain parts of the law should be stopped on grounds that they are wholly unconstitutional. Let's bring in Reginald Kazutu for more analysis on this. He's a financial economist. He's also an associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes University. Reginald, thank you for your time this evening. Let's start with your reaction to the judgment from this three-judge bench earlier today.
Thank you, Rama. I found it a bit interesting because the two main pillars of why they lifted the freeze order on the Finance Act. The first one is in their argument was that there will be irreversible economic damage if the suspension is not lifted. Which I find a bit precarious because then the argument there is the government cannot generate revenue, then it will have to borrow, which is a long-term cost, where government can just postpone implementing some of the projects that they want to implement. The second standing which they used for their argument was that if you then suspend the Finance Act, then you're also suspending the Appropriations Act, which I found a bit not legally sound because there are two different acts and two different documents. The Kenyan people have no problem with what you are spending the money on, which is your Appropriations Act, because no one has done a cost-benefit social analysis to see whether the expenditure makes sense. But people are worried about how you're going to fund that expenditure. So they should not have mixed the two. So I find the decision a bit more leaning towards the government side and not public interest.
Indeed. And one of the things that stood out for me in reading that document was that they were saying, and I'm quoting the three-judge bench, members of the public can get a rebate for overpaid taxes and levies. In theory, yes, but in practice, government has been struggling to even just settle VAT refunds for years now. And on top of that, even just supplier debt. We've been building up a mountain of it to the order of at least $3, maybe $4 billion US dollars. In practice, this argument simply does not apply, does it?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, as in they look a little more from the government perspective and not from the public interest, which they are supposed to defend as the court. Because, as you mentioned, like VAT refunds, by May, we're around 12 to 14 billion shillings, which were outstanding. The process of getting an income tax refund is tedious. You can only file it when you file your return. That means if anything has to be given back as a rebate, can only be done next year, April, when people file, and will be processed within 90 days, and you have to prove that you deserve that rebate. So I think the court on that one got it completely wrong. They should have looked at the issue of KRA and refunds to realize it might be easier for the government to postpone some of the projects that they've put in the Appropriations Act than for KRA to come and give people a refund. And the finance bill itself changes the rules of getting refunds on VAT or on taxes and says if you are not given a refund in due course, then you can offset it to any other taxes that you have. As an individual, especially if maybe housing levy is deducted from my salary or the increased 35% is deducted, what other income do I have to offset that? So I'll end up just having a bulge of money KRA owes me, which I'll never get hold of.
In fact, the fact that money is due to you, it's almost like government is simply borrowing from you. It's a sort of interest-free loan of sorts. Short term, probably a year, might be 2 years, but still, it's essentially debt by another name.
True, interest rate free in that matter. And the problem is that it will have an impact on, one, purchasing power, because until people know whether it's going to stay or not stay, people will temper their expenditure because they don't know whether it's going to be a permanent increase in taxes. Do they need to change their lifestyle? So even in the short term, whilst we wait for the determination of the case, you will find some slacking and reduction in non-essential expenditure as people wait and see whether this is a permanent lifestyle change they have to take or it's going to be temporary.
Right. What about the impact on employment? Because, speaking to some SMEs, some company CEOs, some individuals in C-suite management over the last couple of weeks, the impression I get here is that they're looking at their budget and saying, hang on, we have this massive amount of matched expenditure that we didn't plan for, we didn't budget for, in a time when consumer spending, as you point out, and as we saw with the Bill's numbers earlier today, is essentially constrained. Might this essentially trigger a new round of job cuts?
It definitely will, because for most organizations, other than the cost of production or the cost of goods, the next largest cost is employee cost. And you will then want employee cost to move because when the business is doing well. But Kenya already has a problem of inflated wages that move because of inflation adjustments, which in itself pushes more into the inflation of the country. So employers are going to be faced with a situation where the choice is, do I expand my workforce or do I cut my workforce because then I cannot afford? So do I keep the workforce that I have and reduce my production, reduce my quality, find some way to save money, or do I just cut employees so that I can maintain the same quality? It's a vicious cycle because the increase in those taxes is going to reduce aggregate demand, which again feeds back into reduced revenues for businesses. So if the last year or two we were seeing job cuts, we might see one, stagnation in the short term. That means there'll be no more increase in employment. Then eventually we'll start seeing job cuts going forward, redundancies in the next couple of 8 months, 9 months, in a year's time.
All right, one last question for you. With respect to this housing fund, housing tax problem, because we've seen the Kenyan government in the past has essentially diverted money that was supposedly on paper supposed to be ring-fenced. And we saw that happening in 2020, for example, with the Petroleum Development Fund. Cash that should have been spent on keeping fuel prices relatively low was instead diverted to pay off debt due to the standard gauge railway program. Isn't the exact same thing likely to happen here? Because the sort of cash flow management problems that we've seen in government in the past simply have not been fixed.
Surely, yes, especially in the case where we don't even have regulations to find out how that money is going to be used, how it's going to be implemented. So this will become like the other, we used to have a sports fund where money was supposed to be kept for sports, but that money never used to be dispersed to any sporting activity or sporting team because there was no law or regulation on how to manage it, same as UFA, money that sits in UFA. So we're just creating another pot for government to piggy bank on. And giving the Auditor General quite a lot of work to try and delineate that this is money that came for housing fund, it left here, it went. In the budget, there are some allocations to affordable housing which have nothing to do with the housing fund. How they're going to keep those figures separately and be accountable, I think it's going to be an interesting audit for the next couple of years for the Auditor General's office.
Indeed, and just for the benefit of our viewers, UFA there was the Unclaimed Financial Assets Fund. We'll leave it there for the time being. Reginald Kudzutu, financial economist, joining us there on the program.